Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and it finally feels like summer. The end of school is coming near in June. I have lemonade in my glass, which is strictly a summer thing for me. And I am also proudly sporting my patron Disney princess of Belle to tell you about all the books that I am so excited to read in June. Since the school year is winding down and I will have much more time to myself in June, and because I'm usually pretty exhausted by that point, I like my June TBR to be really fun books that I'm really excited about. Not that that shouldn't be all the time, but anyway. Then this year I discovered a new readathon that I thought would mesh perfectly with that goal. And that is the historical fiction readathon created by Shelley Swearingen. And it looks like a lot of fun, and I definitely have books that fit all the prompts. So let's talk about them. The first prompt was probably for me the toughest to fill, which is to read a book of historical fiction set in the country that you're from. I really don't tend to read American historical fiction. I don't find American history particularly fascinating. But I did remember that I still have Great Circle to read by Maggie Shipstead. I was really excited to read this, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. It's the story of two women, I believe, one of whom was an aviator who was the first or tried to be the first to circumnavigate the globe. Yes. And then there's the modern storyline as well of the young woman who is cast to play Marion Graves, the aviator, in a Hollywood movie about her. This received rave reviews back when it came out, so I'm excited to read it. The next prompt is to read a book set in a different country to where you're from, and that's pretty much most of my collection, like I said. But in particular, I'm excited to get to Island Queen by Vanessa Riley. And this takes place, I think, mainly in the Caribbean, but it might take place in, say, Britain or the United States as well. And reading the back so I make sure I don't get any facts wrong, this is the true story of Dorothy Kirwan Thomas, who was a free Black woman who rose from slavery to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in the colonial West Indies. And I had no idea that she existed. I've had an arc of this for ages. I won it on Goodreads, but it was a Kindle copy, and I tend to forget that I have books on my Kindle because I can't physically see them. So I managed to find this on sale back in December, so I'm finally going to read it. Vanessa Riley also recently published a book about Marie Christophe. I'll put her correct name down here. But the wife of Henri I, who was the first ruler of Haiti after the slave rebellion of 1812. And that sounds fascinating. I know nothing about her. I really know very little about the slave revolt of 1812, except that it happened. I really don't know what happened to anyone on the island after that. So I'm hoping I really love this book so that I can then go on to read that one later. The third prompt is to read a book set in a new-to-you time period. So for this one, I've chosen The Half-Drowned King by Linnea Hartsucker. Eventually, I will start this series. I've mentioned it a couple times this year on my channel. It takes place during the Viking Age, I believe. Yes, we're following Norwegian Vikings, who are mostly in Norway, but occasionally, of course, there are raiding trips to Scotland or Ireland. And we follow two in particular. We follow Ragnvald, who is robbed of his birthright and is trying to win it back. But we also follow his sister, Svanhild, who is trying to be used to create an advantageous match, but also wants to make her own way in the world. And I really know very little about history in what used to be called the Dark Ages. There's a new term for it now, which I can't remember. But certainly Viking era Scandinavia and Britain So this will be exciting. Next up, I should read a book with a speculative or magical realistic element. And for that, I've chosen A Power Unbound by Freya Marsk. This is the third and I think final book in her series. I've loved the first two books, the first one especially, but they all take place in an alternative Edwardian England where magic also exists and is known to exist by some of the population, mainly those who possess it, but there's also a whole government department dedicated to overseeing it and keeping it under wraps. So in the first book, we follow a man who is thrown into this world with no idea what's going on, and his sort of liaison, and they fall in love. Magical adventures ensue as well. To solve the second part of that magical mystery in book 2, we followed one of those characters' sisters and her adventures on a boat. To finish solving the mystery, we are going to follow two characters that we also meet in book 2 and their romance in addition to the finale of this magical adventure. All three books have LGBTQ romance in them as well. They are quite steamy if that's important to you, but I don't mind that, and I loved this series. I'm sad that it's going to end, but I'm really excited to be with these characters again. The next challenge is to read a book from the perspective of an ordinary person. Most of my books, I like to think, are from the perspectives of relatively ordinary people who have done extraordinary things. However, I have two choices for this prompt. If I'm feeling really ambitious, I think this would be a great time for me to finally read The Eighth Life by Nino Rashvelishvili. I think I said that properly. I'm so sorry if I didn't. But this is a Georgian book that I'm really, really excited about. I know nothing about the country of Georgia, and as far as I know, this follows a family over the course of a few generations and what happens to them in Georgia over that course of history. But there's also a connection to this chocolate recipe that is very important. That and the fact that it is a monster of a book. I'll just put that next to my head just for scale. So if I end up with loads and loads of time, I would love to get to this book. However, if I don't have loads and loads of time, I might save The Eighth Life for another day, and I might pick up Mrs. Porter Calling by A.J. Pierce instead. It's looking unlikely that I'll get to it this month, so I might get to it next month instead. It's a much more manageable size book, and this is the third book in the Emmy Lake series. I blanked on her last name for a moment. The series started with the book Dear Mrs. Bird about Emmy Lake trying to make her way in journalism and do her bit for the war effort in London, and as she sees it, being stuck at a women's magazine. And we follow the development of her career and her relationship with that publication over the course of the years, over the course of the war. So this is book 3 in that series. Then the next prompt is to read a book from the perspective of an extraordinary person. Now, like I said, I don't have many of these, but I think I might be able to get away with this one, which is to read The Painter's Daughters by Emily Howes, because this is the story of Thomas Gainsborough's two daughters, the 18th century painter, and how their relationship with him and the fact that they modeled for him for a number of his paintings affects them personally, their relationship with him, their ability to get married, given the attitude that was had towards actresses, painters, models, etc. during the 18th century. So I'm really excited to read this, especially since Gainsborough lived in Bath for a number of years, and I've been through the Holborn Museum, which has a number of his paintings. So I'm really excited to revisit Bath and find out more about him and his family. Next, we should read a historical mystery or a historical romance. I have two choices again. If I'm pressed for time, A Power Unbound does have a romantic element as well, so I could use it for both prompts. But if I have a little bit more time, I'd like to read The Wild Rose by Jennifer Donnelly. Again, this is a monster of a book, so it's a maybe, but I did fly through The Winter Rose back in April, so I might do that again. You never know. This is a series that my college roommate Ellie got me started on in our freshman year. So thank you, Ellie, for that. I'll leave a link to her Bookstagram page down below because it is delightful. But The Tea Rose was her favorite book, and that was the first in the series. And it's a saga where we're following Jo and Fiona as they try to and make their way out of the slums of London in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. The Winter Rose then still follows Fiona and Jo a few years later, but also some side characters that we met briefly in The Tea Rose. So The Wild Rose is going to do the same thing. We're following two minor characters that we met in The Winter Rose. But by this point, all of the characters are on the brink of World War I. And I can't tell you too much more than that because that would spoil things for books 1 and 2. But there is a decided romantic element to at least the first 2 books. So I'm assuming there will be in book 3 as well. They are slightly steamy again, but if that doesn't bother you, they are well worth a read. And then the final prompt is to read a work of classic historical fiction. So for this, I've chosen The Trumpet Major by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was writing at the end of the 19th century, but this book takes place in the Regency, which was the beginning of the 19th century. I really don't know too much more than that, and because it is quite small, and because classics do tend to spoil the novel in their descriptions, I'm going to leave it that way. I'm going to assume we are following a trumpet major in the army, maybe see some of the Napoleonic Wars, or at least see what army life was like at home. There will probably be a romantic element, possibly a tragic element. We'll find out. Then aside from the readathon, there are 2 challenges that I've set myself for this year. The first, which I've had for a couple of years, is to read 1 book of nonfiction every month. So this month, since it is also Pride Month, I thought I would pick up Gentleman Jack, The Real Anne Lister by Anne Choma and partially by Sally Wainwright. This is yet another biography of Anne Lister, who was, I don't want to say the first, but probably one of the first fairly openly lesbian women, certainly in the West, and certainly in Britain. She lived towards the beginning of the 19th century, and at least from the way that she wrote and from the way other people describe her, and indeed from the show, which is based quite heavily on her journals, people around her basically knew, but they just didn't acknowledge it too much. And the reason we know so much about her is through her diaries, which are absolutely fascinating. They were discovered by a man who inherited her family home, and he discovered that there were bits written in code, a code that she had made up herself, with a mixture of Greek letters and Hebrew letters and other symbols. And he managed to crack it, and he realized that the coded bits were her talking about her sex life with other women. And he was horrified, shoved her journals back in the wall, and vowed never to speak of it again. And then they were discovered again about 60 years later in the 1990s by Helena Whitbread, who then went on to fully decode a lot of those journals. And she is the reason why we know as much as we do about Anne Lister. I loved reading her journals. I read a different biography of her as well, which was by Angela Steidola a few years ago. I loved season 1 of the television show. I haven't seen season 2 yet, but I do want to eventually. And so this is another biography by Anne Choma, and she did work quite heavily with Helena Whitbread and with Sally Wainwright, who is the head runner of the television show. And I think according to the back, there are new journal extracts that come to light. So I'm thrilled to find out more. Then I've also been trying to read one D.E. Stevenson per month to get me through the school year. So that means that this month I'll be reading The Young Clementina. I really know nothing about this, and the back doesn't tell me much either. But I do know that D.E. Stevenson's books are always light and charming, usually set towards the beginning of the 20th century in Britain, following ordinary women's lives and the beauty, the tragedy, and the magic that can be found in everyday life. Then, just for fun, I thought I'd pick up two other books. The first is People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. I've heard fabulous things about Emily Henry's books from real-life friends, from people on BookTube, so I thought this summery vibe was absolutely perfect for something light and fluffy. I know she writes very good romances. I know her characters are usually relatively bookish, at least. And I really don't need to know too much more than that. I think this is a second chance romance. We'll see how we do. And then lastly, I'm trying to space out the Court of Thorns and Roses series, so that means that June is time for A Court of Silver Flames. These are, of course, by Sarah J. Maas, and they are very steamy fae romance fantasy novels. This one apparently is the steamiest of the bunch, so I will definitely wait until school is not in session to be reading this, just so my kids don't find out that I'm reading it. Although I do remember seeing 11-year-olds reading these books a few years ago when I had started teaching and they were being advertised as young adults. So that's a fun memory. But nonetheless, these are very light, very fluffy. I don't take them too seriously at all, but I am excited to spend more time with these characters. Well, those are quite enough choices to be getting on with in the month of June. Let me know down below if you are also participating in this readathon, as I'd love to know. I'd love to know if you are particularly excited for me to read any of these books, and I will try to prioritize those as best I can. I want to read them all, but tune in at the end of June to see how I actually did. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye, everyone.